Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. We're going to finish up chapter 23, respiration. Don't forget that we kind of talked last time, and this chapter likes to divide respiration into four, really should be five kind of stages. First step is pulmonary ventilation, and that's what we spent most of our time discussing in the first part of this lecture for this chapter. And so that's simply just air in and out of the lungs. And the second part is going to be gas exchange, specifically alveolar gas exchange. And that's exchanging, we see it right here, alveolar gas exchange, gases between the blood and the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, the air sacs in the lungs. And then we're going to get gas transport, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But after we get gas transport, which is transporting the gases in the bloodstream, then we reach our cells, and we're going to exchange with the cells. And we call that systemic gas exchange, where we move the blood from those capillaries and into the cells of our body that need all that blood to do their functioning. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about both of these types of gas exchange together. Instead of separating systemic and alveolar, we're going to discuss them both together. Don't forget, after we give the cells what they need, then they undergo the true meaning of this term respiration, which is cellular respiration. So then we're going to actually see them taking that sugar, that glucose, and that oxygen and combusting it inside that mitochondria and creating that ATP. And we're going to get to that whenever we finish talking about the digestive system. We're going to go over some metabolism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process there. So today we're going to start with alveolar and systemic gas exchange, and then we're going to finish with gas transport and some, aging kind of things and some other little tidbits. And then we're finished with this chapter, right? So first off, don't forget that gas exchange is simply moving gases, oxygen and CO2, in and out of the bloodstream, either with the lungs or with our cells, with our tissues. And so that's kind of the goal, right? We got two sets of capillaries, two groups of circuits. So we've got the pulmonary and the systemic circuit. And so that's really kind of what we're talking about is, where we're going to exchange, where we're going to hit the capillaries in those circuits. First off, we need to understand, in order to discuss any of this, that each gas is going to move independently. And so I want us to start out by talking about Dalton's law of partial pressure. And that's the way I always like to talk about it. I always like to list it as Dalton's law of partial pressure. And then that way you never forget what Dalton's law is actually talking about, is partial pressure. And basically what partial pressure is what I just said. Each gas moves down its own pressure gradient. So that's what it is in a nutshell. What we're truly going to do, what Dalton's law truly does, is it takes air, atmospheric air, which is actually made up of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. We're about 78.6% nitrogen, about 20.9% oxygen, and then less than 1% of both carbon dioxide and water vapor combined, even. And so most of it is here in our nitrogen and our oxygen. Well, if the overall atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, then what we can do is figure out the individual pressure for each gas. And that's what we call that gas is partial pressure. So we can take the percentage that that gas makes up in the whole atmosphere and multiply it by that total 760 atmospheric pressure. And then that can give us a number to represent that gas's own pressure. And we call that the partial pressure. Now, if we take all those partial pressures and add each partial pressure up, then we should get 760 again, right? And so really what the partial pressure is the pressure exerted by each gas within a mixture, and it's based off of its percentage in that mixture. And this allows each gas to move independently down its own pressure gradient. So oxygen always goes from high to low. It's always highest in the atmospheric air, and it's always lowest in the cells where we consume it. So oxygen is always going to flow in towards the cells. And CO2 is the opposite. We're going to make CO2 in the cells. So it's going to be the highest in the cells, and we're going to move it out of our body. And that's because that the CO2 in the atmosphere is in much lower quantities. It's at a lower partial pressure. So overall, make sure that you understand that O2 goes from atmosphere to cells, and CO2 goes from cells to atmosphere. And that's basically what we're going to talk about here in this process. So Dalton's law gives us that ability to break each gas apart of the mixture and learn its own partial pressure. And here they're actually doing that for nitrogen, 78.6. So move that decimal 2 places, multiply 760 by 0.786. You're going to get 597. So now we can move nitrogen by itself. Do we ever really talk about moving nitrogen though, folks? Not really, right? We're mainly concerned about oxygen and carbon dioxide, O2 and CO2. So those are really the ones that if we were going to calculate partial pressures, those are the more important ones that we would actually calculate. But we're not going to calculate partial pressures. All I want you to know is that Dalton's law gives us the ability to separate each gas and move it by itself. We're going to move it down each gas's own partial pressure gradient. And as I said, O2 is going to move towards the cells and CO2 is going to move out of the cells and towards the atmosphere. And that's kind of what this says. Percentage of oxygen is lower within the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide is higher compared to the atmosphere. And so at the systemic cells, oxygen is lowest and carbon dioxide is highest. And so we're going to end up moving in those directions. Now, here is, again, how we're going to write this. PO2 means partial pressure of oxygen. PCO2 just means the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So if we put that P in front of it, it means that we're only talking about the pressure of that specific gas. And so that's what we're going to see now that we're moving each gas on their own, is we're going to talk about PO2 levels. And here we can kind of see that. And here's what I want you to do as you take notes. These numbers are variable. These numbers change depending on who you are. And so I don't want us to memorize these numbers. What I want you to memorize is highest and lowest, and then in the bloodstream where it's high and where it's low. Okay, so here's the deal. First off, let's do alveolar gas exchange, and that's what's demonstrated right here. We're taking an example from the lungs. Here is the bloodstream. This is used blood coming in. We see the arrow, and here is fresh blood kind of moving out. Oxygenated and decarbon dioxide blood is moving outward towards the body cells. So here's the key. At the lungs, I want you to know that the PO2 is the highest of anywhere that we're going to talk about. And the PCO2 is the lowest of anywhere that we're about to talk about. So if PO2 is highest in the lungs, in this example, and PCO2 is the lowest in the lungs in this example, well, then that means we're going to move oxygen into the bloodstream into the bloodstream, and then CO2 out of the bloodstream, right? Eventually we're going to end up giving that oxygen to the cells, and the CO2 is going to be formed, and we're going to take it from the cells. So that's going to be part of our systemic gas exchange. Let's don't get ahead of ourselves. But that's kind of the whole goal. So first off, our first note, at lungs, PO2 is highest, PCO2 is lowest. Now the next note has to do with blood arriving and then blood leaving after exchange. So don't forget that the blood arriving at the lungs is going there to pick up oxygen. So the PO2 is low. Okay, I don't want you to put lowest, I want you to put low. PO2 is low in the arriving blood, and PCO2 is high in comparison to the lungs. So again, PO2 is low, PCO2 is high. So the O2 is low and the CO2 is high. Now, I want you to make a note that gas exchange takes place. So we're going to exchange across the respiratory membrane here, and we're going to allow the oxygen to come in and the CO2 to go out, right? So now I want you to add a note that blood leaving lungs or blood leaving the alveoli is now high in PO2 and low in PCO2. Whenever we exchange, we always balance. We balance with where it's the highest and lowest. So here we're going to balance. That 40 is going to go to 104 and that 45 is going to drop to 40, right? And so now we've exchanged, and now this blood is basically a mirror image of what the gases were in the lungs. Now, what I want you to realize is the blood that's leaving the lungs is the same blood that's going to arrive to the cells. So, if you want to draw an arrow, you can connect that arrow all the way to the tail of that arrow, because this is the blood that's going to show up here. Now, these numbers are a little different because sometimes we use some of that oxygen in the bloodstream. So, some of our cells need oxygen that are in the bloodstream, so we give them that oxygen. And so the numbers drop no matter what. Here's the key. Let's cover systemic gas exchange now. So during systemic gas exchange, I want you to know that blood arriving to the cells is high in O2, so PO2 is high, and PCO2 is low. Again, it's simply just the same blood that was over here. PO2 was high and PCO2 was low, and that's what's arriving here. Then we can say that in the tissues, the PO2 is lowest because this is where it's consumed, and the PCO2 is the highest because this is where it's actually created. And so at that point, we're going to have exchange. So the blood arriving was high in O2 and low in CO2. So that means that we're going to push oxygen in from high to low, right? And push CO2 out from high to low. So we're going to exchange with the cells, O2 into the cells, CO2 out of the cells. And now one of our last notes for this systemic gas exchange is the blood leaving the cells is now low PO2 and high PCO2, right? So now we've got a low PO2 because we exchanged the oxygen in, and we've got higher CO2 because we got it back out. So now our very last note is this blood is going to go to the alveoli. So now you can connect that arrow all the way up to this arrow. And you can see that this used blood, low PO2, high PCO2, is what arrives at the lungs. And then we're going to hit this cycle one more time. We're going to exchange to a balance. We're going to get high PO2, low PCO2, send it to the cells. Now that we've got high O2 and low CO2, we give the cells oxygen, we take their CO2, and we head back to the lungs, and we're going to do that exchange one more time. So this is just going to keep happening over and over and over again. Now, the key here, and what you may notice, and we haven't really talked about this being odd, but this is a little weird, right? We're exchanging gases between an area that has air or gases and an area that has fluid, which is the bloodstream, right? So this is unique, and this is something that we need to discuss. This is given to us, or this ability is described by Henry's law. Okay, don't really care too much about the gas solubility. I'll explain that. But what I really want to focus on is Henry's law. What Henry's law states is that we can move gases between air and a fluid. And so basically what Henry's law does is it gives us the ability to move gases in and out of the bloodstream. And so this really dictates exchange, giving us the ability to exchange. Now you need to be a little bit more familiar with a fancy definition. At a given temperature, the partial pressure of a gas in a liquid is equal to its partial pressure in that air, right? And so at a given temperature, the solubility of a gas in a liquid is dependent upon two things: the partial pressure of the gas and the solubility coefficient. We're not really going to focus on the solubility coefficient. So really, the partial pressure of a gas when in contact with a fluid, we can push that gas into that fluid, right? As long as we have some contact with that fluid, we're going to do that. Let's think about popping a soda can, right? You have pressure built up in that soda can at the factory, right? And CO2 is in there, and that's the high pressure. You can kind of squeeze on that soda can and feel how firm it is. But then when we pop that soda can and those bubbles start to fizz up and they're releasing that CO2 out, right? In the fluid, in the soda is high CO2, but in our atmosphere is low CO2. So we're seeing that fizziness, and that effervescence is actually due to CO2 leaving the fluid and entering into the environment, into the atmosphere. This is Henry's law in a nutshell. We're moving a gas out of a fluid and into our surrounding air, right? Now the whole key, we're going to move it into and we're going to balance to the same partial pressure. And so that's what we saw in that previous picture, right? Here, 104 became 104. We're going to balance to that same partial pressure. And so it simply just says, not only can we move air between two regions, but we can move air/gases in and out of the bloodstream. Now, a bad use of this would be decompression sickness, which is also referred to as the bends. So if you suddenly expose your body to a quick drop in atmospheric pressure, a decompression, then the body is going to start to malfunction. And what it's going to do is you're going to start to form bubbles in your body fluids, air bubbles. Now, we don't use that nitrogen, but I mentioned that most of what we breathe in is nitrogen. And actually, most of what we breathe out is nitrogen too, right? Because we don't use it, we breathe it right back out. So whenever some of that nitrogen actually gets into our bloodstream, but we just don't really use that nitrogen at all. But if we decompress too quickly, then that nitrogen starts to form bubbles in our fluids, especially in our joints. So nitrogen ending up forming in the blood and in the tissues, but especially in the joints. I want you to know that synovial fluid. Because it forms in the synovial fluid, it becomes painful and it makes a person want to bend over and curl everything up to try to relieve the pressure. And so that's why we get the term the bends. Now, this was very common with people who used to come up from scuba diving too fast. If you don't acclimate as you rise up in your depth, when you come up, whenever you go down, you put yourself under pressure. If you don't decompress properly, as you move up, you have to spend a certain amount of time at each 33-foot interval, right? Because that's one atmosphere. You might not know that, but that's what it is. And so as a result, you have to sit there and pause. If you don't pause and you come up too fast, then you decompress. Nitrogen bubbles form inside of your fluids, especially those synovial fluids, and make you double over, make you bend over, and that gives us the term the bends, right? Now, another way would be to be in an airplane. You're up in the air, and all of a sudden there's a hole in the airplane. There's a breach of the cabin. And so when we go up in altitude, we're going to drop our pressure. Up in altitude decreases pressure. If we decrease the overall pressure from 760 down anywhere, then that also means that the partial pressure of oxygen is going to decrease too. And so as a result, there may be much less oxygen available to breathe. And now you're starting to form these bubbles in your bloodstream and in your joints. One of the main treatments for decompression is to give oxygen, and that's what that oxygen mask is doing, is trying to give you as much oxygen as possible to help fight those nitrogen bubbles from forming and to also keep the amount of oxygen up in your bloodstream so that you're not going to become, ischemic. And so a hyperbaric chamber, many times if someone comes up from scuba diving too fast and they're experiencing the bends, well, they're going to put them in a high pressure oxygen. Pretty much all the gas that's there is going to be oxygen almost. You're going to put them in a high pressure situation, close to 760 millimeters of mercury, right? And that's going to help to dissolve into the bloodstream and help to fight that disorder with nitrogen bubbles or even with carbon monoxide poisoning. This is going to be a treatment. Now, here's that alveolar gas exchange. We've already covered it. We're not going to discuss it again, but from the alveoli, it has high PO2 and low PCO2. So we're going to put the oxygen into the blood and take the CO2 out and then send that to the cells. When it reaches the cells, we're going to give them their goods very rapidly too. Now, I want you to understand that when we exchange at the respiratory membrane, when we exchange at the lungs, this is very quickly taking place, and this is a very efficient process. So it's quick and efficient. There's several different reasons why, but all of these are basically reasons that speed up diffusion. The first is that it's a small distance, right? We've only got two cell layers. We've got the layer of the alveolus and then the layer of a blood vessel. So it's really skinny, okay? So shorter distance means we can travel faster. The gases are lipid soluble. I'm sorry about that. Again, I don't go into the solubility issues, but because lipid soluble structures can move faster through the body because they can get through cells, gases, the O2 and CO2 is lipid soluble. So that means that it can get through there a lot quicker than things that have to use channels like protein and amino acid based things. There's a big pressure gradient. The bigger pressure gradient, the faster the flow. And there's a large surface area. The inside of your lungs, if we filleted all that out and laid it all out, it would make a 70 square meter rug, right? A meter's about 3 feet. So if we go 3 foot by 210 feet, right? A runner that's 3 foot wide, 210 feet long, that's how much surface area is inside of your lungs. So we have a very invaginated and increased surface area that gives us more ability to get that O2 and CO2 exchanged. So you think about it, it's less than a second almost practically that air stays in the lungs. But there we're going to be able to exchange as much O2 and CO2 that's needed to keep everything alive. Here we can kind of see that process. Here is a capillary and there is an alveoli. And so there's that respiratory membrane. It's just a very skinny surface and we kind of see it kind of shown in detail right there. All right. Now, I'm not going to get into these details right here. I don't want to talk about this efficiency of gas exchange, how they're going to do it. So let's don't worry about this slide. Same thing here. You can kind of see how they're talking about what's happening in bronchioles and the arterioles and how they can open and close to control the airflow. Systemic gas exchange, again, we've already covered this. Let's look at the image and just kind of repeat. In the cells, we've got our lowest O2 and our highest CO2, and the blood arriving has high O2 and low CO2. So we're going to exchange to an equilibrium. The blood that leaves is now going to have low O2 and high CO2 because the cells use the oxygen really fast and made more CO2 that it spit out. Now, let's talk about gas transport. So that kind of finished up our gas exchange. We had two more laws. We had Henry's law that dealt with in between a fluid and the air. And then we also had Dalton's law, which discussed partial pressure. And don't forget, going back to pulmonary ventilation, we also had Boyle's law, which discussed that pressure and volume are opposites from each other. Okay, now let's move on to gas transport, and let's first talk about oxygen because we've already talked about oxygen, and then we'll mention CO2. It's not that difficult. Oxygen is primarily carried on red blood cells, right? So oxygen is primarily carried on the red blood cells. So in hemoglobin is where we're going to store that oxygen. But I also want you to realize not all oxygen is stored on hemoglobin. There has to be some oxygen dissolved into the plasma, dissolved into the bloodstream. That's what oxygen is available for cells to use. So we're going to store oxygen that's extra above what we really need at the time. So your blood cells are actually storing a lot more oxygen than is available than the cells are needing and using. And this is why once you stop breathing, you still have stored oxygen on those blood cells, so you're going to remain alive for 3 to 5 minutes. And so it's rare that we fully deplete this hemoglobin. Okay. So just realize that most oxygen, 90+%, is stored at most of the time, but some of it, 10% or so, a little bit less, is available in the bloodstream for exchange with cells. All right. Now, I'm not really worried about the solubility coefficient one more time. The higher it is, the faster it moves. I'm not concerned about that. As I mentioned, most oxygen, it depends on what you're doing. Don't put 98%. Let's put most oxygen is stored on hemoglobin. And so we refer to it when it's storing extra oxygen as oxyhemoglobin, and whenever it has less oxygen, we say deoxyhemoglobin. If hemoglobin is without bound oxygen, then we're in deep trouble because it tends to keep some of that oxygen bound. There are 4 possible oxygens that can bind to each hemoglobin. So usually it's not either it's carrying 1 or not. It's carrying 4, sometimes it's carrying 3, sometimes it's carrying 2. Rarely does it carry 1, and almost never does it carry 0. You're hitting death if it's going to carry 0. You're hitting ischemia and an infarction is going to follow. Now, we need to understand this oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. And basically, this is just a curve showing you at what oxygen levels does hemoglobin carry what percentage saturation of that oxygen. Okay, so here's our saturation curve. Overall, what it says is that as we increase in oxygen, increase in PO2 means that we're going to store more oxygen. And so usually our oxygen levels are somewhere around 90 to 100. And so if we're somewhere around 90 to 100, that puts us at 80, 100%, or 80 to 95% of saturation. Okay, but as we increase oxygen, we're going to store more. Okay, now there's a couple of things that can change this. Right, there's a couple of things that can change this. There, I've already talked about this oxygen reserve, amount of oxygen left in the bloodstream, and this is what keeps us alive, right? If we're exercising, then we're going to drop how much oxygen we have available. We're going to decrease how much oxygen is on hemoglobin because we want it available for tissues. And so that's what I was about to mention, is that some things can make this curve change. Okay, we can make this curve either go this way and kind of redraw it out this way, or we can make the curve go this way and redraw it that way. So this is referred to as a shift left, and basically what a shift left does is at the same oxygen levels, we're going to store more oxygen. Okay, so that's what a shift left does, is it stores more. A shift right, on the other hand, is at the same oxygen levels, we're going to store less. And so shift rights take place when cells are more active and when they need more oxygen. When we need more oxygen, we don't want to store it, right? That's the goal, is store it until we need it. So store it until we need it, but if we don't need it, don't store it, okay? And so if we need extra oxygen, then we don't want to store it, and then that way we have more available. Now, there's three things that can affect this curve very easily: temperature, pH, and the amount of CO2 that's also binding. We're going to find out that CO2 can also bind to hemoglobin. And so temperature, let's relate all of these to exercise. When you exercise, your temp goes up, your pH goes down, and the CO2 goes up. So if temp and CO2 go up or pH goes down, that's going to cause a shift right. Okay, so that's the easy way to remember it. Shift rights take place during exercise. So if temp goes up, shift right. If temp goes down, shift left. pH, lactic acid builds up. So pH goes down during exercise. So that's going to cause a shift right. But if we have a higher pH, then that's going to cause a shift to the left. CO2, during exercise, we make more CO2, so we're binding more to hemoglobin. So as a result, we need to release more oxygen because we're exercising. So more CO2 bound means shift right. Less CO2 bound means shift left. Okay, so we can adjust how much is being carried based on some of these variables. And here you can kind of see what we're talking about: shift rights versus shift lefts. I want you to think about a shift right due to exercise. That increases temp. It's going to decrease pH, and it's also going to affect that CO2 level. Shift left, again, is more at rest whenever we're storing more because we're not needing to use it. Okay, here they're just kind of demonstrating those. You can look at this in your textbook. I'm not going to focus on this. Now let's talk about CO2 transport very quickly. Carbon dioxide transport. First off, carbon dioxide we carry in three different ways. So this is what's made at the cells, and this is our waste gas. Most carbon dioxide is stored in something called carbonic acid or bicarbonate. So we can list that, either carbonate or carbonic acid, because it can switch back and forth between these two. And so most of it is stored, I like to say, in the form of carbonic acid, because when we store extra CO2, we also affect the pH. We drop the pH. Okay, and we're going to find that out whenever we cover our pH chapter. Some of our carbon dioxide is stored on hemoglobin. 23% or so is stored on hemoglobin. And so I want you to realize this is not stored the same place oxygen is. Oxygen is binding at the iron on that hemoglobin molecule, on that heme molecule. But elsewhere on the hemoglobin, on just an amine group, part of the amino acid, that's where we're going to store this CO2. Okay, now we can store CO2 and oxygen at the same time, and it doesn't really affect it that much. We saw how it can cause a slight shift, but overall, we can store both, carry both at the same time without problems. Some of it, again, has to be dissolved in the plasma, because this is what we're grabbing from the cells, and this is what we're going to drop off at the lungs. So in order for it to be exchanged, it has to be dissolved in the plasma, just like that oxygen. Some of it has to be dissolved in the plasma, but we can't store all of it. All right. Now, as I mentioned, bicarbonate can become carbonic acid, and we'll talk about that in the process because we can use that to actually help buffer our pH in our bloodstream, and we'll talk about that when we get to that pH chapter. Let's mention carbon monoxide real quick before we wrap this up. We're almost finished. Carbon monoxide, only one oxygen for each carbon, CO instead of CO2. This is made whenever we burn fossil fuels, right? So burning those fossil fuels is a bad thing. We know that. We know that burning gasoline is not good for our environment. It's not good for our environment, and it's not good for us. We know that people that ride in the back of open Jeeps have had carbon monoxide poisoning very, very easily. And so this is something that can affect people whether they realize it or not. Carbon monoxide, the problem, it doesn't just compete, it outcompetes. It wins when it competes for oxygen at its binding site. Carbon monoxide binds to the same iron ion. And as a result, if CO is bound, it makes it so that oxygen cannot bind. And now you do not store oxygen on your red blood cells, and you're going to die of suffocation. Even though you're breathing, you've got too much carbon monoxide in there that's preventing the oxygen from attaching, and now we got some serious issues. Okay, carbon monoxide poisoning, give them pure oxygen. Okay, if that doesn't work, you may have to have a blood transfusion. You may need to get extra red blood cells to try to get oxygen on those blood cells to help out. Okay, now hemoglobin. Let's talk about a couple of different versions of hemoglobin. Adult hemoglobin, again, is what carries that oxygen in the adult bloodstream. But inside of mama, a fetus, right? A baby before it's born is a fetus. They have fetal hemoglobin. And I want you to know that fetal hemoglobin has a greater affinity. It wants to bind more. It wants to bind stronger. It wants to bind faster. That's what we mean by greater affinity for binding compared to adult hemoglobin. In other words, fetal hemoglobin can rob oxygen from adult hemoglobin. It can actually rip it off and steal it from mama. And that's how baby gets its oxygen, right? And so baby is literally a parasite stealing mama's oxygen from her red blood cells and getting it onto their red blood cells so that they can remain growing and alive inside of mama. And so this fetal hemoglobin, it's just going to get that oxygen. The bigger baby gets, the more hemoglobin it has, and as a result, the less oxygen mama has. So when mama hits that third trimester, she starts to get winded very easily. She starts to get tired faster. A lot of that is due to lower oxygen levels in her bloodstream because the baby is wanting more as it gets, right? So fetal hemoglobin breakdown may have jaundice, right? So yellow tinge to the skin due to the hemoglobin breaking down in infants because it's going to become adult hemoglobin. It's going to change. Hyperventilating is breathing too fast. Whenever you breathe too fast, you're going to get CO2 levels out quicker and you're going to build up O2 levels faster. So we're going to experience hyperventilation whenever we're trying to increase our perfusion, really, right? If we increase the heart rate, we increase the breathing rate. And so if we're increasing heart rate, we're trying to get more blood flowing. We're also trying to get more oxygen into the blood. Okay, low blood levels of CO2 is called hypocapnia. I don't think that's going to show up on the test, but you may hear that term. Hyperventilation, again, many times can be caused by anxiety, and then that can make you feel dizzy or numb or tingling, right? Disoriented. Definitely not a good thing. Hypoventilation is where you're breathing too slow. This could be caused by an airway obstruction or some sort of disease or damage to your brain. And so oxygen levels are going to go down and CO2 levels are going to build up. So, whenever we're resting, we tend to begin to hypoventilate more compared to when we're exercising. We tend to hyperventilate more. And that gives hyperventilation more oxygen to the blood. Hypoventilation, there's going to be less oxygen in the blood, right? We're going to experience hypoxia, and that's a good term for a test. Hypoxia, low oxygen levels in the blood. I want you to take down anoxia, A-N-O-X-I-A. Anoxia means no blood, no oxygen in the blood, right? And that's definitely a bad thing, okay? So, again, hypoventilation, lethargy, sleepiness, headache, cyanic tissue, you start to appear blue, right? So kind of crazy. All right, so that's it for our respiratory chapter. The second half was much shorter than the first. The second half covered gas exchange, both alveolar and systemic, as well as gas transport, and then a couple of little things here at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, but make sure that you're studying as hard as you can so that you can get the best grades you can on this next test. All right, hope y'all have a wonderful afternoon and talk to you soon.